Hi everyone, I'm Nathan. I'm the head of the Alabama Outreach Branch, and this is the public forum topic lecture for the December talk.
Hey guys, I'm Adonay. We're just gonna run through the basics of the argument, history, and everything you need to succeed on this topic.
All right, so this month's resolution is that the United States should substantially reduce its military support of Taiwan. So let's break that resolution down. So two key topic terms is that first, that substantially reduced part. There's a lot of symbolic implications here between tensions between the US and China that can carve the path for some really strong perceptual arguments. The second, leading off of that, is just some basic power dynamics between what the United States and China's struggle for hegemony is going to look like once we pass or negate the resolution. And then the third part is the golden balance between maintaining peace with China without provoking them, and that term is called strategic ambiguity, which we'll get into later. Then the second key term that stands out to me is military support. Right now, there's a lot of different ways the US is providing support to Taiwan, whether it's through funding or directly selling weapons to them, which is called arms sales, or by stationing US troops. So on to some history about the Taiwanese conflict between the United States, China, and Taiwan is first that even though we treat Taiwan like an ally, on paper, we actually aren't allowed to call them one. But regardless, we still provide them massive amounts of military aid and massive amounts of other like economic ties because we find it beneficial. And one of the largest amounts of weapons we give to Taiwan right now includes like drones and missiles and tanks and other forms of technology that we sell. Also, bringing China into this story, what's really going to be important on this topic is something called the One China policy. So after the Chinese Civil War between the Republic of China, the People's Republic of China versus the Republic of China, the Republic of China, that party lost and was driven to the island of Taiwan. And that's when claims that Taiwan, and at that point, the People's Republic of China, the victorious party, claims that Taiwan is now a part of their mainland and not a sovereign nation, but Taiwan, which is the old Republic of China, still wants to say that they sovereign. And tying into that, that means that the US acknowledges this one China policy and states that on paper, Taiwan is not a country. That's the only way the US can sustain diplomatic relations with China without angering. And Adna, you can take.
So, a bit of brief background on the topic. First, let's go into hit relations. So, right now, the sitting leader of the Chinese Communist Party, Xi Jinping, has consistently threatened to invade Taiwan by 2027, mainly because it's a really important year for China as a whole because it's the 100th anniversary. Further, right now, there are large amounts of military drills, with just this past month, us seeing active blockade drills around the island, further threatening propaganda and continuous cyber attacks for the past few decades. Further, right now, we're seeing large amounts of sanctions against the Taiwanese economy, from small things like a certain plant produce being banned that's key to their exports, or possibly cutting off access to key materials. But it's all because China views them as a part of their country, while Taiwan wants more of a democratic sovereign state. This is mainly because we saw a transition from the original, more moderate, peaceful party, the KMT, to the DPP, which is a much more progressive party that calls for Taiwanese strength and independence in the face of US support. Right now, Taiwan has repeatedly ruled out peaceful reunification, with both parties advocating for better ties with China, but an absolute non negotiable point of never joining the PRC. So Biden has currently taken a much more polarizing stance on the matter by saying that he would send US trade troops to aid Taiwan in the case of an invasion or aggression, which really contradicts the current stance of strategic ambiguity. So, getting a bit of background on the region itself, one of the major organizations in the region is called ASEAN. It's the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. And right now, a majority of the countries recognize China's one China policy. This is basically just an agreement between the PRC and the ROC struck back a couple decades ago, in which they both agreed there is one China, but never actually defined what party it represents. It's basically just agreeing to disagree. That's kind of put off a lot of the world, and up until now, we're seeing a greater amount of countries siding with China purely due to their huge amount of economic influence. And that's really key when it comes to ASEAN, with smaller economic powers like Laos, Philippines, and Cambodia turning towards China because they're really impressionable through foreign direct investment. Further, a lot of allies in the region are somewhat vulnerable to greater amounts of Chinese aggression, namely South Korea and Japan, due to their proximity between China and Taiwan, and a lot of them see Taiwan as basically a foothold in the region, which means that if we concede there, South Korea and Japan would be next. India, on the other hand, has consistently had pretty chilling relations with China. They continuously escalate along the LOC or the western border. They have a bunch of gray zones there. And right now, their relations with China are pretty cold, but their relations with the US are also not the greatest. Australia is a really key US ally. We have a major base and presence there, and they currently view China as a major threat in the region. So, a bit of background about what China is doing right now. So, China right now claims itself by international charter as an island nation. So, that just means that they're allowed to claim the water space in other nations' territory in a region called the South China Sea. And basically, what they do is they just take a bunch of sand or a bunch of sediment, drop down enough of it in certain points in the South China Sea such as that they can claim the waters of other countries. So they've been really aggressive with Japanese fishing boats, have been shooting water cannons at Philippine fishermen and ships, and have overall just been trying to assert greater levels of aggression and dominance throughout the region. Particularly, they're posing a greater threat to South Korea, Japan, and the Philippines, with the Senkaku Islands kind of being a really big hotspot for conflict between China and Japan. So just a bit of background as to how close they are. So China and Taiwan are right across each other, and there is a very major trade route between the two. It's called the Taiwanese Strait. It's just a narrow stretch of water between China and Taiwan. As you can see, it's a massive shipping route throughout the region, and it's protected by the UN for freedom of navigation. Xi claims the strait belongs to him since Taiwan is a part of China, the PRC, and in turn, the entire SCC belongs to him. That's why you're seeing greater amounts of aggression right now. Taiwanese allies pretty much show support, which is going to be relevant for this topic, by sailing ships through. The US has done it consistently, Japan has done it consistently, and greater amounts of US allies are just doing it right now. So, for example, the US, Canada, Germany, the UK, and it's basically just a perceptual stance that tells Xi that they do not respect his authority in the region, nor do they allow for greater amounts of Chinese aggression.
So now into the arguments. We'll start with the app. So probably the most stock argument on this topic is simply going to be provoking China into war. So the uniqueness is pretty simple. Right now, US presence in the region and proliferating weapons to Taiwan is the reason China is so angry. And the link is very simple. When we pull out that presence from Taiwan, it relieves China from feeling like they have to prove themselves to the rest of the world militarily, and they're going to be much more friendly in terms of relations. And the impact is that regardless, or the impact is that if we don't affirm the resolution and pull out of the region, China is going to have to feel like they're forced to invade Taiwan, and that'll inevitably involve the US. And you can either run that one with a conventional warfare scenario, or two, have it involve into nuclear escalation, which is really good for things like extinction. Then the next contention is a little bit similar, but it instead concedes that China is going to invade Taiwan regardless. At that point, the way the link is different is that instead, if China is going to invade regardless, the best decision the United States can make is pulling out of the region so we don't get entangled in the crossfire and ultimately again escalate into one, a conventional war with China, or two, nuclear escalation. All right. Then on to some more niche arguments. The first one is overstretch. So right now, in the uniqueness and in current geopolitics, there's a lot of like different wars going on and a lot of scenarios where you can say that an ally is struggling without US support. I can name a couple, like Ukraine or Israel, or a lot of poor countries in Southeast Asia like Myanmar or the Philippines are also really struggling. And the link is really simple. It's that right now we're pouring too much unnecessary money into Taiwan, and when we take that money out, we can better repurpose it into better areas, i.e., Ukraine or Israel, like I said before, and the impact is anything specific to what's happening there. Then is regionalism. So this one's probably one of my more favorite arguments. The uniqueness is that right now, the US is probably Taiwan's only like military crutch when it comes to defending against China. But the link is that when you decrease US support, it means that other allies now have to play big brother to Taiwan. It's when they realize that China is posing a major threat to Taiwan, it means that it could also pose a threat to them as well. So it kind of unifies the region. You're painting this narrative that when everybody bands together in Southeast Asia, you're having a stronger deterrent against China. And again, the impact is just going to be something like war or nuclear escalation if China ever does decide to. All right, then self-reliance is the next argument. This one's a little interesting. We'd say that right now, like I said before, because the US is Taiwan's military crutch, it's actually too reliant on us for aid, and without it, it wouldn't be able to like survive in the short term. So our link this time is saying that when we decrease US support, Taiwan is forced to boost up their own military. And that's really good because in the end goal, we want Taiwan to be able to support itself without us, right? So the impact is still a China war scenario, but it's one where Taiwan will be able to deter itself against it.
So just to run through a few neg arguments, it's going to be, I think, four. So start out, it's just the opposite scenario that Nathan was talking about, and probably the most stock argument on the neg. It's that right now we have large amounts of peace. For the past 40 years, we've shipped arms to Taiwan, and that's what's actively deterred China because China is inherently an aggressive actor that wants to reunify, but only US presence is stopping it. Pulling out of Taiwan to a significant extent emboldens Xi to invade, and there are a lot of fun impacts you can run here. So if you are running structural violence, it might be preferable to go for human rights, the toll of war on civilians, and then try to steer the round away from existential threat. Or if you just have a really stock traditional round, it might just be better to go for regional stability or conventional war and just what would happen to the world as a whole. So more of a utilitarian view. Or if you want to take a more niche route, you could go into the economic impacts of a Poland uh, Chinese takeover of Taiwan. So Taiwan produces over 90% of the world's semiconductors. There are a lot of implications in terms of trade, goods, and most importantly, military strength, because semiconductors are used in literally every piece of technology around us. So I think there's a lot of implications here for the US's foothold in the world, which is just our sheer military and technological dominance, and also what could happen in domestic markets. So, say how investors would react to a pullout and how they would adapt around the scenario they're given. So, look at right now when Trump just won the election, and a lot of things that Trump has publicly said he'll support have seen surges in stocks. So, for example, Tesla surged 14% just after Donald Trump was officially declared the winner. Maybe you would see a similar thing, but in the opposite direction with a pullout of military support, triggering investors to steer away from Taiwanese chip maker TSMC or AML, and then tanking the semiconductor industry as we know it, in turn cascading between every single sector that relies on them. And that kind of takes out the US economy as we know it, because you can't build anything if the machines that need it need semiconductors. You can't ship anything. And it's a really nuanced argument. I think there are a lot of fun directions you can take this in. So, kind of getting into the broader perspective on this, the US has really good economic ties with Taiwan right now. And if we abandon them, that damages relations with Taipei. They stop giving us good trade deals and in turn would have to go towards other actors. So maybe that means they try to go for a more peaceful unification with Taiwan, with China, and cement ties with them, or they seek out other allies that are going to provide them with the arms they need. Maybe they're adversaries, maybe they're people we're not on the greatest terms with, but the point is the US would be excluded. So, biggest impact for us is going to be the loss of a trading partner. So, kind of what I got into earlier, they are responsible for a majority of the semiconductor industry that we have now. So, at a minimum, you would see maybe a higher price end for semiconductors and a taxing toll on the United States economy as a whole. And in the worst case, you would see a full pullout. So it kind of just depends on the judge you get and how likely you are to prove that there's going to be a full out recession in Taiwan will basically kill the world economy. Or if you're going to go for a more conservative view and just say the US is going to get to have to pay a larger price for the same goods we have now. And kind of the more broad view of this would be regional economic stability. If Taiwan is no longer trading a lot with the US, they could turn to other countries that could create new world powers because they have greater access to semiconductors and in turn could ramp up their militaries and domestic production. And there's also a separate argument of just emboldening China to, no, yeah. So this is more actor specific. It's just the idea that the US has good relations right now. US abandoning Taiwan damages relations. They stop giving us good trade deals and they turn towards China, which means that, for example, maybe they go for greater levels of strikes on their blockades, through blockades, or try to cut off access to technology as a whole. So I would implore you to look more into this scenario. But just a few months ago, the PRC conducted a blockade drill in which they proved they were able to cut off access to over 90% of the energy that Taiwan needs to produce and 70% of its food. It is an island, heavily depends on trade, and the loss of the US, who could possibly provide them with supplies to deter the worst impacts of an invasion, or outside help if they need in the case of an invasion would mean that we are ill-equipped to respond, and China would just be able to plow through and force a peaceful reunification. And I would implore you to look at CSIS and a lot of different war games that prove that a blockade is more likely than an invasion and also would take a lot less time, something more like 2 weeks, which is kind of what we expected with the Ukraine scenario. But generally, invasion or blockade, however you choose to interact with those two, the blockade is probably going to work better on judges who are more inclined to believe China would not go into a full-out war.
Yeah, sorry, we forgot to change the topic on that slide, but it is a very strong narrative and it's probably one of the best neg arguments.
Okay, so this is kind of the opposite of Nathan's preferred argument here. It's that US presence in the region reassures allies that we actually care about the region and will protect them, even though, let's say, the arms sale might not reach the country, or maybe the country doesn't even really need it to deter. It's more a sign of the United States acknowledges your existence, acknowledges your needs, and in turn will provide. So countries like Korea and Japan would in turn be more likely to stay with the US, and countries that are somewhat hesitant, like the Philippines and Laos, are more likely to turn to the US. Pulling out, on the other hand, would lead allies to question US credibility as a protector of the current world order and democracy. So, a few implications here. One, you could see countries turning towards China and attempting to assure their position in the New World Order as China rises to power. That's really bad for the US for a few reasons. One, you get a lot of instability in the region that could possibly cascade into conflict. Or two, you lose access to one of the biggest tech sector hubs in the country or in the world, because of course, outside of semiconductor production, East Asia is responsible for a large amount of technological innovation. Second, you see that you're undermining collective security agreements. So if Japan and Korea see our ability to hold the region safely is undermined by a pullout, they could possibly turn towards ramping up their own militaries, going into nuclear proliferation, which would in turn destabilize the region more. Because if China sees Taiwan as a threat to its narrative, it would probably see nuclear weapons as an even greater threat to its very existence. That kind of gets into this general idea of a loss of US hegemony. US strength in the region has preserved 40 years of peace and prevented large scale conflict by forcing parties to negotiate with each other. By removing the US from the region, you could see large amounts of conflict, a higher chance of miscalculation, and possibly even nuclear war. Another kind of more nuanced angle here is going to be the Taiwanese domestic issues. So I would implore you to look back at the Japanese Article 9 topic because it's kind of a similar idea here. Taiwan's military readiness is key to deterring China, but the industry as a whole is not self-sufficient. It needs the US to supplement it. A US pullout would mean Taiwan diverts a majority of its resources to revamping its own military, which means you're going to see less semiconductor trade, maybe trade-offs on food since it depends on outside countries for 70% of it, and trade-offs on energy since over 90% of its energy comes from the outside world. So, best case scenario, you see the Taiwanese economy suffer alone. Worst case scenario, you see that cascade across the region because if Taiwan produces less semiconductors, other sectors are unable to produce at their original level. And in turn, you could see a cascading worldwide recession. So overall, I really like this argument, but I think you really need to look into what production is now, what it could look like in the future, and maybe the gap that it has to fill in, given the United States has issued out billions of dollars in arms sales and hundreds of billions of dollars in funding across the past few years.
So that's it for the topic lecture, but really quickly as we finish, I'd like to invite all of you that either watched this video recorded beforehand or saw this flyer before to join the Alabama Outreach Branch. We're a statewide branch from a national nonprofit that provides free speech and debate resources to everybody, including in other countries as well. The GroupMe code is up there. Follow us on Instagram as well. And we're also recruiting state leadership branches right now. So we need a bunch of directors and a bunch of resource teams. And it's a really good opportunity for college apps and also to make a difference in your. So make sure to check us out. Even if you didn't come to the meetings again, I hope you found this video helpful as well. Bye guys.